Every generation swears they survived the scariest horror movie ever made. But fear evolves. From alien paranoia of the 1950s to demonic possession of the 1970s and even modern social horror of the 2020s. Today, we're going to go decade by decade to find out which one hits the hardest, which one terrorized its generation the most. And at the end, I'll rank them one against the other to crown the most traumatizing horror movie of all time. So let's get to it. The 1950s were an age of paranoia. We had the Cold War, McCarthyism, and the fear of losing your identity. Invasion of the Body Snatchers tapped directly into those anxieties. Beneath its alien plant premise was a terrifying metaphor of conformity and distrust. This film showed that horror didn't need monsters dripping in blood. No, the real terror could be your neighbor or even yourself. Viewers felt genuine dread that their neighbors could be emotionless imposters. Invasion weaponized a real social fear, which is losing your identity. And the concept of conformity was a cultural expectation and also a quiet nightmare. Post-war suburban life prized sameness, obedience, and suppressing individuality. So when the movie showed ordinary people quietly turning into unfeeling, obedient copies of themselves, it hit a real psychological nerve. The pod people were more terrifying because they looked normal. They could be your spouse, your boss, your neighbor, and you might not know it until it was too late. In the 1950s, there was growing unease about how technology, suburbia, and consumer culture were changing human relationships. Life was growing increasingly sterile and mechanical. Identical houses, identical families, identical jobs. The film took that subtle discomfort and made it literal. A world where you stop feeling love, fear, or joy. And that idea, not just dying, but continuing to exist without your humanity, was new. It was chilling and absolutely unforgettable. By using realism instead of spectacle and allowing the danger to spread across a quiet, small, familiar American town, the film had audiences walking out questioning their own world and glancing suspiciously at one another. And it gave voice to a uniquely 1950s American nightmare. The fear that safety and normalcy themselves might be a trap, and that in seeking perfect order, we could lose what makes us human. Back when monsters were men in rubber suits, Hitchcock showed audiences something way scarier. A normal guy with severe mommy issues and a very large kitchen knife. People developed a fear of showers. Censorship rules changed, and killing the main character halfway through the film had never been done, so it caught audiences completely off guard and broke that invisible shield protecting our beloved protagonist. Nobody, and I mean nobody, was safe. But Hitchcock didn't just shock audiences, he rewrote the rules. No filmmaker had ever blended this type of psychological terror with slasher-type elements so effectively. With that single shower scene, Hitchcock turned horror into something intimate, something unpredictable, and deeply human, setting the blueprint for every psychological thriller that followed. The stabbing was never explicitly shown, but the rapid cuts, the shrieking violins, and suggestion of nudity made it feel so brutally graphic, with some moviegoers reportedly refusing to shower afterwards, a genuine nationwide phenomenon. Even censors were shaken. Hitchcock pushed the limits of what was considered acceptable on screen, paving the way for modern horror as we see it today. Norman Bates was terrifying because he wasn't a monster. He was human. His dual personality and fixation on his dead mother introduced mainstream audiences to psychological horror rooted inside the human mind, not the supernatural or alien. And for viewers raised on atomic monsters and gothic vampires, this was far more disturbing. The idea that evil could live in a seemingly polite, lonely young man. Hitchcock caught America at the exact moment it was losing faith in its own innocence, and his control over the film's release itself was traumatizing, as he reportedly ordered the doors locked once the movie began so audiences couldn't come in late, creating a kind of social pressure cooker. Newspapers reported lines around the block, people left screaming, trembling. It blew open what movies could depict, proving and paving the way for other cultural juggernauts like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist. It's hard to really put into words how influential this film was to a horror as a whole. It was a true masterpiece and a defining movie experience for all who were lucky enough to be there at the time. The 1970s are widely regarded as the decade when horror stopped being really campy or allegorical and became deeply, viscerally real, often reflecting cultural trauma from the Vietnam War and the collapsing faith in, our institutions. When The Exorcist hit theaters in 1973, audiences fainted, vomited, and ran for the hills. It was that disturbing. But beyond the shock, it represented horror's evolution into the mainstream. This is the first time horror was treated as serious cinema. It tackled faith, guilt, and evil on an epic scale and proved that horror could be both sophisticated and soul-crushingly terrifying. Unlike earlier supernatural films, The Exorcist took its horror deadly serious. It didn't wink at the audience. It played the story of demonic possession absolutely straight, using realistic acting, documentary-style cinematography, and a modern Washington, D.C. setting. And this grounded realism made the supernatural horror feel plausible, even to non-religious viewers. The 1970s still had a largely Christian moral framework, and The Exorcist directly confronted this. A young girl uttering vile obscenities and blasphemies. Scenes including crucifixes, vomit, desecration are just a few examples of how this film attacks the uncomfortable. The audience is suggested, they're told that evil could possess innocence, even a child in her own home. That left viewers shook. For religious audiences, this wasn't just shocking, it was spiritually terrifying. The film expertly mirrored the 1970s crisis of belief. The story begins as a medical mystery with doctors probing Reagan's body with invasive procedures and ends in a desperate act of faith. It struck deep chords with viewers questioning whether science alone could explain human suffering. Many saw it as a metaphor for the chaos of the decade, the moral collapse, family breakdowns after the peace and love 1960s failed to deliver us to paradise. Many viewers believed it was based on a true possession, which only intensified the hysteria. It was horror that didn't stay in the margins. Priests, parents, and the church publicly protested it, which only made people go see it more. And it created the modern idea of serious horror and consistently ranks as a movie that scared the most viewers for life. If Psycho shattered the innocence in the 1960s, then Exorcist shattered the soul. It wasn't just scary, it made people confront the possibility that evil wasn't out there somewhere. It could be inside your child, your home, or yourself. The 1970s gave us psychological and spiritual terror like the aforementioned Exorcist and fellow horror titans Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, but the 1980s were the decade when horror went mainstream and became personal and graphic in entirely new ways. The 80s were about the collapse of the body and mind. Special effects were more realistic, home video made horror accessible to everyone, and filmmakers gleefully pushed boundaries. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining turned isolation and madness into art. Jack Nicholson's descent into insanity inside the Overlook Hotel became one of cinema's most iconic performances. The film's eerie symmetry, haunting score, and ambitious storytelling made it more than just a ghost story. It was a psychological labyrinth. The 1980s were full of slashers, but The Shining stood alone as horror's masterpiece of atmosphere and madness. While The Exorcist showed external evil, The Shining turned inward. It wasn't a monster or demon, it was Jack Torrance losing his mind, trapped with his family in isolation. For many 1980 audiences, this was shocking because it suggested that madness could erupt in any ordinary person. Extreme violence could come from within your own family, and you might not even recognize it until it's happening way too late. Audiences didn't just fear Jack Nicholson's character, they feared what he represented: the collapse of the American father, the rage beneath the nuclear family. The atmosphere of this movie is suffocating. It literally never lets you breathe. Kubrick didn't rely on jump scares. He used symmetry, silence, and sound masterfully to build unbearable dread. The long, winding Steadicam shots and the unnatural dialogue made viewers feel trapped inside a nightmare that never let up. For many, it wasn't just a movie that you watched, it was something that happened to you. The Overlook Hotel, grand, bright, and beautiful, it became hell itself. Audiences were deeply unsettled by how the film made a luxurious, civilized space feel predatory and haunted. It symbolized something that scared the 1980s mindset, that beneath America's polished exterior was madness, addiction, and extreme violence. The 1980s opened with economic uncertainty and rising divorce rates, and Jack's failures as a provider, his alcoholism, and his history of domestic violence embodied fears that many American families were quietly living through. When he snaps and hunts his wife and child through the hotel, audiences saw echoes of real domestic horror, not fantasy. It was a stark contrast to the teen-focused slashers of the era, which were more fast-paced and gory fun. The Shining was a slow, cerebral, psychological horror that was designed to provide no cathartic experience, just permanent dread. Many walked out confused or shaken, not screaming, but emotionally drained. Critics were divided at first, with some calling it cold and incomprehensible, but that alienating effect became exactly why it traumatized viewers. The Exorcist terrified people's souls. The Shining terrified their minds. It didn't make you jump, it made you question reality itself. And by the time the credits rolled, people weren't screaming anymore. They were just sitting there in stunned silence, unable to shake the feeling that the horror hadn't ended, it had followed them home. The 1990s were a fascinating turning point in horror history. By this era, audiences had become somewhat numb to the gore and slasher excess of the 1980s, so horror had to reinvent itself, and it did by getting psychological, intimate, and disturbingly grounded. The Silence of the Lambs blurred the line between horror and prestige drama. Winning 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, it brought horror into the highest ranks of filmmaking. Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling redefined the genre's villains and heroes. Intelligent, complex, and terrifyingly real. This wasn't supernatural horror, it was the horror of the human mind. It made evil intelligent and seductive. Before this, most cinematic killers were either monsters or maniacs. Then came Hannibal Lecter, polite, brilliant, articulate, and utterly monstrous. Audiences weren't ready for a villain who could get inside your head instead of chasing you with a knife. His calm demeanor, psychological manipulation, and taste for human flesh created a new kind of fear, the terror of the civilized psychopath. People found themselves fascinated by Lecter, even liking him, while being repulsed by his crimes, and that contradiction deeply unsettled viewers. The film turned horror inward, forcing audiences to confront uncomfortable questions. Why are we drawn to monsters smarter than us? Could evil wear the face of culture and sophistication? And unlike supernatural horror, The Silence of the Lambs felt plausible. Buffalo Bill's serial killings were rooted in real-life cases, notably Ted Bundy and Ed Gein, and his basement dungeon hit a little too close to home for many. Audiences were left shaking by how remarkably ordinary that level of evil looked. The 1990s were marked by a wave of fascination and fear around serial killers. rising distrust of the government institutions, and growing public discussion of gender identity and violence, all of which are woven brilliantly into the movie's subtext. It was a mirror held up to a society fascinated by evil, yet terrified of what it said about itself. The mix of clinical realism and primal fear made people feel unsafe in their own world, not some haunted house or alien planet. Viewers reported feeling unclean after watching it. They often imitated but never replicated "Hello, Clarice," followed by that empty stare, were cited as recurring nightmare triggers for many. And it wasn't about jump scares, it was about being psychologically violated. The Shining made people fear their minds, but The Silence of the Lambs made them fear the minds of others. It traumatized not with gore or demons, but with conversations, quiet, intelligent, surgical horror that left audiences realizing evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles and asks you to sit down. The 1990s left viewers intellectually disturbed by killers like Hannibal Lecter and John Doe. The 2000s made audiences feel every ounce of pain on screen. Realism, paired with the need to outdo everything that had come before, led filmmakers to continue ramping up the violence and gore shown on screen. This battle for shock horror supremacy led to the birth of the torture porn subgenre and what critics called the Decade of Dread. Instead of some random killings, Saw forced victims to choose between mutilation and death. The moral participation, what would I do, made viewers squirm in ways that monsters never could. It replaced screams with the sickening question, could I survive this if it were me? Love it or hate it, Saw changed horror for a new generation. It revived the genre with its twisted puzzles, shocking ending, and a villain who doesn't kill out of rage, but philosophy. It birthed a decade of torture horror, but underneath the gore, Saw was about choice, consequence, and survival. It's a grim reflection of post 9/11 cynicism and fear. The story wasn't supernatural. It was a man testing people's will to live through elaborate traps. And the settings, they looked and felt real. They were not cinematic, and they left audiences convinced that a man like Jigsaw could exist. His philosophy, punishing moral failure through pain, felt like a twisted echo of global guilt and retribution themes that saturated the era. Audiences fainted, vomited, and left theaters. Even seasoned horror fans reported feeling contaminated afterwards. The gruesomeness wasn't just gore, it was personal, forcing viewers to imagine their own bodies in the trap, their own will put to the test. The now iconic final twist, realizing who the killer was all along, made people gasp, scream, or sit there in stunned silence. It redefined the modern horror ending. The film's success birthed the annual Saw tradition, a Halloween ritual of endurance. Even those who avoided it directly could not escape its cultural impact. The puppet, the traps, the voice, they were everywhere. If Silence of the Lambs terrified us with psychology, Saw terrified us with consequences. It forced audiences to confront their own limits of pain, morality, and empathy while reflecting a decade obsessed with punishment and control. By the time the lights came up, most viewers didn't cheer or laugh. They just sat there wondering, what kind of person dreams this up? And what did I just watch? After the torture and shock decade of the 2000s, audiences became desensitized once again to gore. So filmmakers shifted the focus from pain to psychological dread, grief, and existential terror. Horror became smarter, quieter, and more emotionally devastating. In the 2010s, horror became art again, and Hereditary led this charge. Ari Aster's debut film combined family tragedy with occult terror, creating a slow burn nightmare that felt real even when it went supernatural. It symbolized the rise of elevated horror, where grief and trauma were just as horrifying as demons and serial killers. And by the end, audiences didn't know whether to clap or cry. What begins as a drama about a dysfunctional family dealing with loss slowly mutates into a nightmare about fate, inheritance, and cultism. Viewers were not prepared for that shift. It felt far too real for far too long before it became far too horrifying. People went in expecting a haunted house movie and they came out speechless. The film doesn't just use death as a plot device, it forces the audience to sit in the weight of it. And there's no relief, there's no catharsis. It's a slow, suffocating, and it's filled with imagery that feels like depression made visible. Many viewers, especially those who had recently lost someone, described the movie as emotionally violating. This all without mentioning the infamous scene, a shocking and sudden death about 30 minutes in that left the theater dead silent. Audiences were traumatized not by gore, but by the reaction that followed, which was one of the most realistic depictions of grief ever filmed. That moment, it changed the movie forever, with many viewers saying they couldn't get that scene out of their head for days, even weeks later. Instead of jump scares, Hereditary weaponized atmosphere. It uses naturalistic lighting, uncomfortable silences, and droning sound design to create an otherworldly feeling that's difficult to properly explain. It's not a boo type of horror. It's like something is wrong and you can't escape it. And by the end, the movie reveals something much larger and more terrifying than any ghost or killer. The idea that your family, your fate, your trauma are all part of a larger, inescapable plan. That existential helplessness hit audiences on a level that transcended normal scares. With a rise in documented cases of depression and anxiety, the film's depiction of grief and family breakdown felt uncomfortably real, and the idea that the danger is within your own home resonated deeply. A24, the studio behind the film, ushered in the elevated horror trend that blends art house filmmaking with existing terror. It was unique, it was horrifying. So if Saw made people fear pain, then Hereditary made people fear real emotion. It taught audiences that true horror doesn't come from what's outside, it's from what's inherited, what's buried deep, and what's inevitable. By the end, Hereditary didn't just scare people, it made them confront grief itself, and that's why it's remembered as one of the most disturbing films of the decade. The 2020s are redefining horror for the social media age, and Talk to Me captures that perfectly. It's a film about addiction, peer pressure, and how we chase thrills no matter the cost. With its unique possession ritual and unflinching emotional core, Talk to Me proved that Gen Z horror could be both brutal and deeply human, setting the tone for where this genre is heading in the future. Talk to Me uses a deceptively simple premise. A group of teens find a severed, embalmed hand that lets you talk to the dead, but in reality, it becomes a gateway to possession, horrific self-harm, and trauma. The horror is visceral and immediate. The film features scenes of self-mutilation, body contortions, eyeball trauma, and grotesque involuntary acts. Scenes that many viewers say made them look away or physically recoil. It taps into deeper emotional wounds such as grief, guilt, loss, and identity. The film's tone and imagery linger. Many viewers have said they had nightmares or unsettling thoughts long after the film ended. And rather than relying on big supernatural reveals, the movie builds slowly, then unsettles you with the combination of body horror and emotional manipulation. The threat is partly internal. The characters themselves become the danger, which is more disturbing than an external monster. The presence of cell phones, social media live streaming, and peer validation add a layer of realism. The ending offers less comfort, with the final state of the protagonist being ambiguous and haunting rather than neatly resolved. Talk to Me makes us fear ourselves, our grief, our addictions, our digital self, and how easily we might lose control. It's not just a scary movie, it's one that stays with you, haunts you, and makes you question your own boundaries. All right, and now with the movies of each decade picked, I'm going to go ahead and rank them against one another. And I'm going to do this the opposite of the way I normally do. Normally, I go from worst to best. This time, we're going to start with the best and work our way down. So, the number one spot goes to the gold standard of horror, and that's 1973's The Exorcist. No film before or since, has combined shock, critical acclaim, and pure terror like The Exorcist. It wasn't just a hit; it became a phenomenon. Number two, I'm going to go with Psycho because this was sort of the birth of modern horror. Psycho reinvented what horror could be. It broke cinematic rules, by killing its protagonist super early, and it introduced audiences to psychological terror grounded in realism. It was Hitchcock's bold direction and Bernard Herrmann's score that forever changed suspense and inspired decades of slasher films. Number three, I'm going to go with The Shining. I think that Stanley Kubrick's The Shining elevated horror into high art. Its ambiguity, its visuals, and atmosphere turned a haunted house story into a psychological descent that scholars still dissect to this day. It's less about scares and more about dread, and that type of fear never leaves you. Number four, we're going to go with Silence of the Lambs. I think that this is, a nice prestige horror piece. It won 5 Academy Awards. That's unheard of for a horror movie. So The Silence of the Lambs proved that horror could be respected at the highest levels. Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter became an icon of intellect and evil, and the film's deep psychological tension made it one of the smartest horror movies ever made. And then following immediately after that, we're going to go with Hereditary, the modern masterpiece. It redefined 21st century horror with its gut punch performances and emotional devastation. It's not about demons, it's about grief, family, and inevitability. The slow burn tension helped usher in the elevated horror movement that's still shaping the genre to this day. And we're going to jump from one of the newest ones to one of the oldest ones. Number 6 is going to be Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This was the first great metaphorical horror. And while tamer by today's standards, Invasion stands as a pioneering allegory. Beneath its sci-fi surface was a political and social warning about conformity and identity. Its influence echoes through masterpieces like The Thing and Us, and countless other paranoia-driven stories. And then number 7, we're going to go with a game changer, Saw. Saw revived horror in the 2000s, blending morality with gore. Its clever twist, minimalist production, and iconic villain Jigsaw spawned an entire subgenre. And while it's less artistic than some of the others here, its cultural footprint and financial success cannot be denied. It made horror profitable again. And then in last place, and this is probably just because it's the newest film on here, is going to be Talk to Me. This is the new face of fear. It's still early in its legacy, but Talk to Me has earned respect for refreshing modern horror. It combines supernatural possession with emotional realism, capturing Gen Z's obsession with connection and validation. It's not yet genre defining, but it's a promising sign of horror's future. And every one of these films represents the peak of its decade's fears. If The Exorcist is the king of horror, Psycho is its architect, The Shining its philosopher, and Hereditary its heir. Together, they show how horror has evolved from paranoia to possession, from monsters to minds, and still keeps finding new ways to haunt us. Which decade do you think nailed horror the best? Comment down below any films that you feel should have made this list and why. And if you loved this trip down the dark side of cinematic history, hit the like button. If you're new here, think about subscribing to this channel for even more horror and entertainment content. But as always, until next time, be good people, be good to each other. We'll see you then.